They laughed. Not a chuckle, not polite amusement. They laughed. Across boardrooms and late-night panels, in press briefings and backroom conferences, from aerospace veterans with medals on their lapels to seasoned economists behind mahogany desks, they all dismissed him. Not in whispers, but in the open, with headlines and hashtags, with knowing smiles and rolled eyes. Elon Musk, the eccentric billionaire with his wild eyes and disheveled hair, had made too many promises. Colonize Mars, revolutionize cars, drill, tunnels under cities, connect the human brain to machines, and worst of all, launch rockets and land them again. It sounded like the plot of a sci-fi serial. To some, it was delusion. To others, it was ego. But to Elon, it was destiny. He stood in rooms where no one took him seriously. He pitched SpaceX when private spaceflight was a punchline. He promised reusable rockets when even NASA engineers smirked at the notion. Aerospace giants scoffed from their towers, their polished shoes planted firmly in traditions older than Elon himself. He didn't come from their world. He wasn't military, he wasn't legacy. He was PayPal and startups, internet money and viral tweets. He had no right to be speaking their language, and yet he kept speaking. In the early days of SpaceX, the factory floors were mostly empty and the nights were long. The team was small, sleep-deprived, underfunded, and constantly staring into the jaws of failure. Elon slept on a beanbag or under a desk, not because it was some stunt, but because he didn't have time to go home. He poured his own fortune into Falcon 1, the first rocket they'd attempt to launch, and when the first launch failed, they laughed. They said, "Of course it did." He smiled, tight, quiet, and kept going. The second attempt exploded too. Now they were roaring. News outlets ran headlines suggesting it was all a vanity project. Analysts predicted SpaceX wouldn't survive another year. Competitors scoffed, openly. Even some on his own team looked unsure. But Elon didn't blink. He studied the telemetry, pored over the video footage, picked apart the error as if it was a riddle the universe had left just for him. On the third attempt, the rocket made it off the pad. It cleared the tower. It flew higher than ever before. There was silence, brief, breathless silence. But then the engine sputtered. The flight veered, crash, a third failure. Investors began backing away, not angrily, just quietly, like people leaving a table they never really wanted to sit at. Elon had now sunk nearly every dollar he had left into these launches. They told him, "You gave it your best shot." He told them, "I'm not done." He scraped together just enough for a fourth launch. Just enough fuel, just enough parts, just enough faith. It would be their last chance, not in theory, in fact. If the fourth launch failed, SpaceX would collapse. People were already preparing the eulogies, and still, they laughed. Because the thing about visionaries is, they always look foolish before they look brilliant. The fourth rocket stood on the launchpad like a final breath before silence. The Florida sky was clear, the kind of blue that stretches endlessly, daring anyone to challenge it. Elon Musk wasn't in some glass office tower surrounded by yes-men. He was at the site, eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights, hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything. There were no backup plans anymore. No cushion, no safety net. Tesla was barely afloat, Solar City was under pressure, and every ounce of his wealth, his credibility, and his spirit had been burned as fuel for this moment. The Falcon 1 rocket wasn't just a machine. It was a line, in the sand between trying and succeeding, between being mocked and being remembered. People thought he was obsessed. Some said he was dangerous. Others whispered that he was brilliant but had finally reached too far, like Icarus reaching for the sun. The countdown began. 90 seconds. Elon stood still, surrounded by a skeletal team of engineers and technicians who had been with him since the beginning. They had nothing left to give but their belief in something no one else saw. 50 seconds. In aerospace circles, the silence before ignition isn't peace, it's pressure. 30 seconds. Some of the engineers couldn't watch. A few turned away. Others gripped the edges of their desks so tightly their knuckles turned white. 10, 9, 8. Falcon 1's engines roared to life, a plume of fire and thunder erupting beneath it. The rocket rose slowly at first, like it was testing its own courage. Then it climbed, slicing through the sky, pushing against gravity, against doubt, against everything. No explosion, no sudden failure. It climbed. Elon didn't speak. He barely breathed. His gaze was locked on the screen, calculating every second, every twitch of velocity, every whisper of telemetry. Higher, into the atmosphere, past the altitude where the first rocket had failed, beyond the point where the second had buckled, through the barrier that had doomed the third, and then stage separation, perfect, smooth, a clean break. The second stage ignited like a torch passed between gods. Cheers erupted in the control room. Not loud at first, but swelling, shocked, disbelieving joy. The rocket stayed on course. Orbital velocity was achieved. Space. They had done it. And Elon Musk. He didn't jump. He didn't shout. He just exhaled, a slow, bone-deep release like a man pulling himself from the edge of the abyss. That day, September 28, 2008, the laughter stopped. No one said it aloud. Not yet. But everyone who doubted him, mocked him, dismissed him, they felt the shift. Something massive had happened. SpaceX had become the first private company in history to put a liquid-fueled rocket into Earth's orbit. It changed everything. NASA called. Suddenly, the outsider was sitting across from government. Officials who had once dismissed him as reckless. They needed launches. He had the only rocket on the planet that had proven itself in the private sector. Contracts followed. Money, resources, legitimacy. The thing they had all said couldn't happen had happened. Elon had taken the laughter, the cynicism, the condescension, and turned it into thrust. Elon Musk didn't celebrate in the way people expected. There were no parades, no victory laps, no hour-long interviews basking in vindication. He simply went back to work. Because to him, the successful launch of Falcon 1 wasn't a destination, it was a beginning. While others were still processing the implications, Elon had already shifted focus to Falcon 9, a larger rocket, more powerful, more ambitious, designed not just to reach orbit but to carry payloads that could support entire missions, scientific, commercial, and eventually human. The naysayers had quieted, but they weren't gone. They repositioned. They said the Falcon 1 was a fluke. That scaling up was different. That luck had smiled on him once, but it wouldn't again. They said Falcon 9 would fail under its own weight. They said reusability was a fantasy. They said landing a rocket vertically on a tiny barge floating in the ocean was science fiction. Elon just nodded, took the criticism, filed it away, and then built what they said was impossible. While other aerospace companies were still reliant on massive government budgets and multi-year timetables, SpaceX was moving like a startup, fast, focused, hungry. Engineers worked 20-hour days. Components were tested and redesigned at a pace that broke every rule of traditional aerospace manufacturing. Elon didn't just want to build rockets. He wanted to revolutionize how rockets were built. Meanwhile, Tesla, too, was catching fire, figuratively and nearly literally. The Model S was on the drawing board. Critics said electric cars couldn't be fast, sexy, or luxurious. They'd be golf carts, boring, overpriced. Elon disagreed. He poured money from his SpaceX wins into Tesla, stretching himself thin, borrowing, against the company, pushing timelines, firing executives when they said something couldn't be done. He wanted zero compromise. He demanded performance and sustainability. There were days, even then, when payroll was almost missed. when it all felt like a house of cards trembling with every breath of uncertainty. But again and again, Elon stared at the chaos, nodded quietly, and walked straight into the fire. Back at SpaceX, Falcon 9 rolled out. It was massive compared to Falcon 1, 9 Merlin engines, thousands of moving parts, and a single brutal expectation: don't fail. The first launch succeeded. The second, 2. Payloads were delivered. Contracts grew, but still, Elon wasn't satisfied. The rocket must land. Why? Because a reusable rocket would slash costs. It would open the door to rapid, frequent access to space. It would make Mars possible. They mocked the idea. Again, you don't land rockets. You build them, launch them, and let them crash into the ocean. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it must be. But Elon hated that phrase. That's the way it's always been. He built a barge and named it with dry irony, "Of course I still love you." A robotic landing platform in the middle of the ocean, waiting for a rocket to come home. And the first attempt? It failed. The second? 2. The rocket came down too fast. It tipped. It exploded. But each time, Elon got closer. He studied the data, adjusted the code, upgraded the landing gear. He treated failure not as defeat, but as information. "You're wasting money," critics said. "Just accept expendable. Launch." But he didn't want expendable. He wanted evolution. Then, on December 21st, 2015, it happened. The Falcon 9 lifted off from Cape Canaveral. A perfect ascent. The second stage continued its mission. But the first stage, it turned. It dropped through the sky, slowing itself with controlled burns guiding its descent with cold gas thrusters and grid fins. And then, on a concrete pad not far from where it had launched, it touched down. Perfectly. The world watched in awe. The impossible had been done, and those who once laughed were now silent. Some tried to downplay it. "It's just one landing," they said. But they knew. Everyone knew. Spaceflight had changed forever. After that first historic landing, the paradigm didn't just shift, it fractured. What Elon Musk had accomplished on that December evening wasn't simply about rockets or reusability. It was about declaring war on the status quo, about shattering the glass walls that surrounded industries long grown comfortable with stagnation, inefficiency, and slow-motion ambition. Landing a rocket wasn't supposed to be possible, they said. Not in reality. Not in this decade. It was. Something reserved for science fiction, for big-budget films and fantasy worlds. But Elon had dragged it into the real world, with carbon fiber, stubborn obsession, and code rewritten 1,000 times in the dead of night. The aerospace giants, those old titans with their decades of legacy and government support, were watching now, not with ridicule, but with grim, quiet concern. Because the joke was over, Elon wasn't just making bold claims anymore. He was delivering results, one after the other. In the months that followed, SpaceX turned the impossible into routine. Another rocket landed, then another. Ocean landings. Drone ship recoveries. Nighttime descents guided by precision burns and steel nerves. Reuse became not an outlier, but a strategy. Each landing chipped away at the old way of doing things. Launch costs plummeted. Customers lined up. NASA, once hesitant, now leaned in fully, awarding SpaceX contracts that once would have gone straight to Boeing or Lockheed without debate. And through it all, Elon barely paused, because he had never intended to stop at Earth. From the beginning, Mars was the goal. The Red Planet wasn't a slogan. It wasn't branding. It was the reason why. And everything else, Tesla, Solar City, Neuralink, even Twitter barbs, was orbiting around that singular gravitational pull. While the world applauded Falcon 9, Elon was already working on something bigger. the BFR, the Big Falcon rocket, later renamed Starship 2 stages, fully reusable, built to carry humans to Mars. Not someday, not in 2050, soon. It looked unlike anything before it. Stainless steel like something out of a retrofuturist's dream, towering higher than the Saturn V, with engines designed from scratch. The Raptor, a methane-powered beast capable of deep space reusability. They mocked it again. Too ambitious. Too heavy. Too complicated. The test tanks wobbled. The first few prototypes exploded spectacularly. SN1 through SN7. Failures. Test flights that ended in fireballs or shredded landing gear. The headlines returned. Elon's Mars dream goes up in smoke. And still, he pushed forward. He tweeted through it all. Photos of mangled rockets, videos of mid-air detonations, captions that read, "Progress." Because that's what it was. Failure didn't frighten him. What frightened him was fear of failure. The idea that anyone would accept good enough. Then came SN8 high-altitude flight. 10 kilometers. Belly flop maneuver. Controlled descent. The world watched, breath held. It flew, danced, dropped like a skydiver through the air, righted itself. Then it hit the landing pad too fast. A fireball swallowed it whole. But Elon grinned. He tweeted, "Mars, here we come," because every sensor worked. Every stage had gone as planned, except for one miscalculated thrust. A solvable problem. SN9 followed, then SN10. Each time, closer, then came SN15. On May 5, 2021, the stainless steel Colossus lifted off from Boca Chica, Texas, and completed a perfect high-altitude test. It flew. It flipped. It landed. No explosion. Victory. But Elon didn't take a vacation, because the final goal hadn't changed. The ambition wasn't to build a rocket. It was to build a civilization. To create a world where humans were not confined to one planet, vulnerable to extinction, to asteroids, to ourselves, where life could multiply across worlds, thrive beyond Earth's gravity well, and become something bolder. It sounded impossible. It still sounds impossible, and yet here he was, not pitching it, but building it. While critics were catching up to yesterday's success, Elon Musk was already living in tomorrow. Because for him, proving them wrong was never the finish line. It was just another launch pad. In the years that followed, the success of Starship's high-altitude landing, the world shifted in ways that even Elon Musk's most ardent followers hadn't fully anticipated. What had once been the pet project of an eccentric billionaire was now the backbone of the new space economy. What had once been considered a string of lucky gambles was now seen as the blueprint for modern engineering. The laughter had turned to silence. Then silence to curiosity, and now they were listening. Governments that had once scoffed at privatized space travel were suddenly reaching out, not from the top of their high towers, but from behind desks filled with uncertainty. Nations that had once prided themselves on their sovereign launch systems were now signing contracts with SpaceX, using Elon's infrastructure, his satellites, his rockets, and his vision. Starlink, his global internet constellation, blanketed the Earth in a web of low-orbit communication. In remote villages, jungles, deserts, and oceans, people now access the internet for the first time, not through governments or telecom monopolies, but through a constellation of satellites launched on rockets that had once been laughed at. Musk wasn't just altering the skies, he was altering access. He had democratized connectivity, and with every launch, every success, SpaceX became more than a company. It became a proving ground for possibility itself. But the most significant shift wasn't in the sky. It was in the psyche of humanity. Suddenly, people were dreaming again. Not just of apps and markets, but of stars and dust, of interplanetary life and civilizations not yet born. Children who would have once looked to the stars and thought, too far, were now drawing Mars colonies in classrooms. because Musk had made the universe feel reachable. Still, the road wasn't easy. The environmentalists came for him. The economists came for him. The politicians, especially those whose industries he'd disrupted, came with hearings, regulations, accusations. You're burning too much fuel. You're destabilizing markets. You're moving too fast. To each challenge, he responded not with stubbornness, but with iteration. When critics slammed Starlink for light pollution, he launched VisorSats, darker satellites with shielding, reducing the brightness. When they warned about space debris, he developed automated collision avoidance software, making his satellites smarter, more aware, less likely to contribute to orbital clutter. When they mocked his tunnels beneath Las Vegas, the Boring Company's first major test site, he didn't just argue. He dug, he built, and then he let them ride in it. And through all of this, Mars loomed closer. Starbase, his private spaceport in Boca Chica, Texas, transformed from a humble construction site to a sprawling facility where rockets as tall as skyscrapers stood waiting for the moment the green light would flash and history would crack open again. He began testing Super Heavy, the booster that would carry Starship beyond Earth's gravity. The test flights were brutal, loud, unforgiving. They scraped the sky, roared back down, and exploded in blazes of fire. Critics returned, sniffing the smoke, trying to resurrect their old doubts. But now the world saw the fire differently. The explosions weren't failures, they were chapters. Each test was a letter to the future, a declaration that the impossible was only waiting to be iterated. The first full-stack Starship and Super Heavy system launched. It made it past Max Q through the region of maximum aerodynamic pressure. It climbed higher than any of the test flights before. Though it was ultimately destroyed after stage separation, no one mocked it this time, because everyone understood what was happening. The man they once laughed at was now defining what progress looked like. And still, Musk kept going. The Dear Moon project, sending civilians around the moon. The announcement of the first crewed Starship test, the simulations of Martian habitat modules. The development of orbital refueling, essential for interplanetary travel. Every time people blinked, he had moved 10 steps ahead. At Tesla, self-driving AI and neural networks were nearing breakthroughs. In Berlin and Austin, gigafactories rose like monuments to vertical integration. Batteries were getting denser. Power walls were appearing in homes across the world. He was decentralizing energy, challenging legacy automotive, challenging telecom, challenging launch monopolies, challenging time itself. And yet, Elon Musk did not slow. He lived on factory floors, slept in conference rooms, sent late-night tweets equal parts genius and chaos. He was imperfect, unpredictable, undeniably human. But in that chaos, there was creation. He wasn't aiming for popularity. He never had been. He was aiming for a future where humanity didn't die with Earth. A future where the species that built cathedrals and cell towers and symphonies would build domes on Mars. Where we would take our laughter, our pain, our languages, and flaws, and multiply them across the stars. In the 5th year since that first rocket touched down, children were watching launches not in awe, but in familiarity. The impossible had become normal. And somewhere deep in the desert, another rocket was rolling toward the pad, taller, faster, heavier. A system designed not for fame, but for survival. Because to Elon Musk, proving them wrong wasn't personal. It was a requirement for saving the species. And there was still one planet left to conquer. The red dust swirled beneath the simulated Martian atmosphere inside the hangar-sized habitat module, where engineers, biologists, and software specialists moved through a mock-up of the life that would one day exist off Earth. Elon Musk stood just outside the observation glass, watching the trial unfold. They were running a full-cycle test of closed-loop life support, oxygen regeneration, waste recycling, algae for photosynthesis, water reclamation through vapor condensation. The systems were crude, early, delicate, but they were working. It wasn't a fantasy anymore. It wasn't a joke or a punchline on a late-night show. It wasn't theory. It was happening. The same man who'd once been jeered at for talking about colonizing Mars was now leading teams designing meals that could be grown in pressurized greenhouses under radiation shields. He was allocating resources for regolith, processing plants that could one day mine oxygen and water from beneath the Martian crust. Every blueprint, every wireframe, every pressure test was another step toward the goal that had once seemed like the delusion of a madman. But he remembered it all. The snide smirks when he first said multiplanetary. The eye rolls when he posted crude drawings of Starship. The industry experts who swore he'd never get one rocket into orbit, let alone land a booster. The think pieces, the hit jobs, the betrayals from investors. He remembered when SpaceX was down to one rocket, when Tesla almost missed payroll, when critics told him, "You're not an aerospace engineer, you're not a car guy, you're not an energy expert." But he hadn't needed to be those things. He just needed to see further than the people who had gotten comfortable in their little boxes. And now, those same critics were signing contracts, buying Teslas, installing Starlink, licensing patents, calling him for meetings. They weren't laughing anymore. The world had evolved, not without struggle. There had been explosive tests, bruised egos, regulatory battles, media storms, and deep controversies. Elon himself had often been the epicenter, a flawed, polarizing, stubborn force who didn't hide his rough edges. But the future he envisioned was not some neat, curated, polite utopia. It was raw, bold, and real. It had teeth, it had fuel, and it had direction. In the newly constructed Starbase Command Center, a dozen large screens displayed orbital paths, countdown timers, thermal readings, and live telemetry. One of them showed a mission prep screen. Starship 3, primary mission, Mars surface cargo delivery. It was no longer about speculation. This mission was real, funded, engineered, fueled. The launch window was in 2 weeks. This time, the payload wasn't a satellite or a Tesla Roadster. It was infrastructure, solar panels, excavation bots, supply drones, emergency food pods, inflatable shelters. They were no longer just exploring Mars. They were building it. Elon walked the length of the command center slowly, quietly. He didn't need to say anything. Every person in that room, every engineer who'd worked 80-hour weeks, every technician who had lost sleep over a loose screw or coding bug, knew what was at stake and what was coming. The media frenzy surrounding the launch was unlike anything seen before, not because of spectacle, but because of meaning. People weren't just watching to be amazed. They were watching because they believed. The arc of history was visible now. It was no longer a faint theory on a dry erase board. It had heat signatures. It had countdowns. It had passengers. And still, Elon Musk didn't pause to celebrate. He was already looking past the launch, past the landing, past the first human footprint pressed into Martian soil. He was thinking about what came after. Because building a civilization meant more than one rocket. It meant 1,000. It meant education, governance, ethics, culture, medicine. It meant asking new questions about who we are when we stand under a different sky. It meant carrying humanity's contradictions to another planet and figuring out how to do better there than we did here. Elon wasn't seeking a perfect world. He didn't believe in utopia. He believed in iteration, and humanity, flawed and fierce and beautiful, was the most important prototype of all. The morning of the launch arrived. At Cape Canaveral and at Starbase, eyes turned to the sky. School children, sat cross-legged in classrooms across the globe, watching the feed with wide eyes. Grandparents who had once witnessed the moon landing tuned in again. Millions of hands hovered over keyboards, ready to document the moment the engines ignited. The countdown began. To -10. The ground trembled, steam poured from the fuel lines, sunlight catching on the silver skin of the rocket. Ignition. Starship 3 roared to life. The earth shook. The sky cracked open, and as the rocket climbed, carrying with it the hopes of an entire species, Elon Musk stood at the edge of the launchpad, alone, hands in pockets, watching it disappear into the atmosphere. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because somewhere, echoing across time, across old headlines and viral memes, across conference rooms and doubting voices, the laughter had long since stopped. And what remained was a silence filled with awe. They had laughed at Elon Musk, but he didn't stop. He just proved them wrong, and then he changed the world.